Story #1. Little Marin. When I was a child, my grandmother used to tell me stories, especially on stormy nights when the wind howled through the trees and lightning made the lights flicker. One story, in particular, stayed with me. At the time, I thought it was just a tale. But as I grew older, I realized it was something more. It wasn't just a family legend. It was terrifying, haunting. She always began the same way. I was just a little girl during the war. She lived in a suburb where everyone knew each other's business. The air was heavy with uncertainty, while factories worked around the clock to support the war effort. Every week, news of deaths from the front lines reached their small town, shattering families. My grandmother, just a teenager at the time, worked as a babysitter for a family down the street. The mother, Deborah, was a factory worker, and the father, Stephen, was serving overseas. Their little girl, Marin, was 5 years old, a bright and cheerful child with a smile that could light up any room. But one day, everything changed. The first sign. It was a bitterly cold day when my grandmother arrived at their house. Normally, Marin would run up to her, laughing and eager to play. But that day, Marin sat in a corner, her eyes unnaturally dark, her demeanor cold. Instead of giggling, she screamed about the light being too bright and her dress being too tight. I couldn't calm her down, my grandmother said. It was so unlike her. When Deborah came home, she looked as though she'd aged years in a single day. She'd just received devastating news. Her brother had been killed on the front lines. They hadn't told Marin. She was too young to understand. But her sudden outburst had coincided exactly with the moment Deborah got the call. It was only the beginning. Terrifying changes. Over the following days, Marin's behavior grew more disturbing. She began speaking of things she shouldn't know, detailed descriptions of battles, bombed-out villages, and dying soldiers. Her voice would sometimes lower to a guttural tone as her eyes rolled back into her head. Each time there was a new report of casualties or battles, Marin's episodes would intensify. It was as if she were somehow connected to the horrors of the war. Neighbors whispered about possession. Children made up cruel nursery rhymes about her, fueling the rumors. One day, while my grandmother was visiting, she heard music coming from Marin's room. Curious, she entered and found the girl sitting at the family piano, her tiny hands playing a complex melody. Marin had never learned to play. Her voice, deep, old, and foreign, began to sing in Italian. The melody sent chills down my grandmother's spine. Marin's unblinking eyes locked onto her as she played, her lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. The bloody night. The breaking point came one evening when my grandmother heard the stairs creak. She looked up and saw Marin at the top of the staircase, holding something in her hand. It glinted faintly in the dim light, a razor blade. Step by step, Marin descended the stairs, leaving smears of blood with every step. Her feet were sliced open, the skin and muscle hanging in strips, yet she didn't seem to feel any pain. As Marin reached the bottom, she began singing again, the same haunting Italian opera. Her voice echoed through the house, growing louder and louder until it felt like the walls would crack. Deborah rushed her to the hospital, leaving my grandmother to clean up the blood. But when she entered the bathroom, she found Marin's skin and muscle arranged in a grotesque mosaic on the floor. At the hospital, Marin remained unresponsive. Priests were called, but nothing seemed to help. It wasn't until Deborah received news that her husband, Stephen, had been found alive that Marin finally stirred. She woke, as if nothing had happened. The disappearance life returned to some semblance of normalcy for the family, but Marin was never the same. She grew quieter, more reserved. People claimed she still had strange abilities, predicting deaths and accidents with eerie accuracy. The last time my grandmother saw her was years later, sitting on the steps of the town's church. "Do you dream?" Marin asked, her pale face turned toward my grandmother. Before my grandmother could respond, Marin stood, dusted off her dress, and walked away, disappearing into the night. Sometime after, Marin vanished for good. Deborah found her bedroom empty, the window wide open. They searched the town and the surrounding woods, but found no trace of her. Some believed she ran away. Others whispered that something far darker had taken her. My grandmother never forgot. On stormy nights, when the wind howled and the lights flickered, I could see that same haunted look in her eyes. "She's still out there," my grandmother would say, waiting, watching, smiling, like something else is living inside her. Story #2, The Whisper in the Dark. I live in a quiet town in the heart of England, surrounded by rolling hills and fields that stretch on forever. It's the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happens. Yet, over the past week, my life has taken a terrifying turn. It started with a dream. The first encounter. Tuesday night, I followed my usual routine after work. Dinner, scrolling through my phone, and a nap before gaming with friends. By midnight, I was in bed, exhausted. But as I lay there, setting my alarms, a wave of unease settled over me. It felt like I was being watched. I glanced at the window. The crack in the curtains was small, but it felt like eyes were staring through it. Mustering some courage, I pulled the curtains open. Nothing but darkness outside. I blamed the feeling on fatigue and drifted off to sleep. But then, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just restlessness. But then I heard it. My name, whispered softly but insistently. I walked through the house, finding everyone else asleep. Somehow, I found myself heading outside, my bare feet on the pavement. The street stretched endlessly before me, far longer than it ever had in real life. The houses on either side felt warped and distant, their windows like hollow eyes watching me. It felt like walking through a dream or a nightmare. Eventually, I reached the end of the road, where an old, abandoned building loomed. Springfield Asylum. It had always intrigued me, but now it radiated a sinister energy. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and as I approached, I heard a voice scream my name, loud and guttural. I reached for the door. Just as my hand touched the handle, my alarm jolted me awake. The second dream. I tried to brush off the dream as stress, but the next night, things got worse. The same feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I opened the curtains again, and, once more, saw nothing. But as I lay down, I felt paralyzed, my body refusing to move. Then the voice came back, louder and more desperate this time. "Help me. Please help me," it begged over and over. Scratching noises echoed from the window. Long, grating sounds, like nails dragging across glass. The voice grew more insistent. "Won't you let me in?" In my frozen state, I could only move my arm. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain, and the voice erupted into laughter. The glass vibrated from the sound, and outside, the fields seemed to twist and churn like a storm was forming. I woke up drenched in sweat, the laughter still echoing in my ears. A terrifying reality. By the third night, I was determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I decided to walk to Springfield Asylum in the daylight, hoping to confront my fears. The evening was strangely quiet. The usual hum of passing cars was gone, leaving an eerie stillness as I approached the asylum. The smell hit me first, rotting meat, just like in my dream. I stopped in my tracks when I heard it. A voice calling my name, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the building, from the dark, shattered windows. My hands trembled as I stepped closer, peering inside. 2 glowing green eyes stared back at me, burning like embers. Then it rose. The figure stood at least 10 feet tall, its skeletal body covered in decaying flesh. Its antlers scraped the doorway as it moved, and its face, a horrifying mix of skull and stretched skin, dripped with blackened saliva. It raised a hand, a twisted, humanoid thing where hooves should have been, and pointed directly at me. Voices erupted around me, a cacophony of whispers, screams, and cries for help. I heard laughter, sobbing, and languages I couldn't understand. It felt like standing in the middle of a train station, filled with the lost souls of the world. I ran. The creature followed me with its glowing eyes, but it didn't move. It simply watched as I fled, its laughter trailing after me. The asylum's history, I locked myself in my room, trembling. When I calmed down enough to think, I researched the Springfield Asylum. It had been abandoned for decades, once a place of horrific treatments and cruel experiments. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen was tied to that place. Even now, as I type this, I feel its presence. Sometimes, I hear my name whispered from the other side of the window, and I'm too afraid to look. What did I encounter? A skinwalker? Something worse? All I know is that it's watching me, and it's waiting. Story #3, The Schoolhouse Ghost. It was supposed to be a harmless prank. My best friend Pete and I had spent weeks planning it. The target? Our younger siblings, who we wanted to scare senseless by taking them to the old schoolhouse outside of town. We'd visited the place before, a crumbling, abandoned building hidden deep in the woods. It had always been eerie, even in broad daylight. The windows were filthy, and the air inside smelled of mildew and rot. It was the perfect setting for a ghost story. The cemetery discovery. The afternoon before the prank, Pete and I scouted the area to make sure it was still safe. While exploring, we stumbled upon something we'd never noticed before. A small cemetery behind the schoolhouse, half hidden by weeds. The gravestones were old, dating back to the 1800s. All of them were children's graves, their lives cut tragically short. Pete smirked. "This is perfect. We'll tell them the schoolhouse is cursed by the spirits of these kids." I laughed along, but unease settled in my chest. Something about those graves felt wrong, like we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. The night of the prank. That night, we loaded the kids into Pete's car and drove to the schoolhouse. On the way, we told them the story. The school was haunted by the ghosts of children who died there. By the time we arrived, the kids were on edge. The moon cast long shadows across the building, making it look even more sinister. We led them inside, spinning more tales about the cursed spirits. But then I saw something, a shadow moving across the window, quick and deliberate. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Pete. He grinned, thinking I was trying to scare him. wasn't. The ghostly woman inside. The air was thick and suffocating. As Pete's flashlight swept across the room, we both saw her. A woman's legs, thin and pale, gliding across the floor in an old-fashioned dress. She disappeared before we could process what we were seeing. "What the hell was that?" Pete whispered, his voice shaking. We didn't stick around to find out. The man in the woods. As we ran outside, we stopped dead in our tracks. The dummy we'd rigged for the prank was gone. In its place stood a man. He was tall, his face hidden in shadow, but his eyes glinted coldly in the moonlight. He started walking toward us. "Run!" I screamed. We bolted through the woods, the man's footsteps echoing behind us. The third child. In the chaos, I lost track of my sisters. When I found them again, they weren't alone. A third child had joined them. A girl with pale skin and pigtails, wearing a dress from another era. She didn't move like the others. Her hair didn't sway, and her eyes were unnaturally still. When I reached out to touch her, she shot upward into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. When we reached the car, Pete revealed the prank's secret. His friends had played the roles of the ghost and the man in the woods, but they hadn't brought the girl. Who or what was she? To this day, I don't know.